Hi, I'm Roby, and this is already the fourth video in the series Art Start Stories. When learning a new language, one of the best ways to practice it is to write stories in a new language. However, not everybody is good in making up stories. So we suggest then to start with a painting that is illustrating your story. But it's also not easy to find a story in a painting. So I made a series of videos for the one who is guiding the students, showing how I think one can use paintings for this purpose. And this video is about landscapes. And I start with this small painting. It's 23 by 19 centimeter, and it clearly demonstrates already what is typical of landscapes. The artist often simply creates lines and colors that suggest a landscape, leaving the viewer to imagine the rest. This is another work of my father, who was a visual artist. So I grew literally up among paintings in progress and a few finished ones. Those were the landscapes. He'd leave in the morning and return in the afternoon with new work, mostly landscapes, because that's easy painting on a sunny day or on a rainy day. So the work that filled the studio were commissioned portraits and narrative paintings. Some sat there for years, and some were never finished. I'm from the first half of the last century, a time before television. We also lived on the edge of a forest where not much happened, so I was often in the studio, where the record player was. That had a huge influence on where my interest naturally gravitated: visual art and music. That's why my older brother also became a visual artist, while I was admitted to the Antwerp Royal Academy of Art. However, after just a few weeks, I knew for sure that it wasn't making art, but presenting it that was interesting me the most. So I didn't study art history, where you learn to place a work of art within a specific art movement. That's also very interesting, but I'm more interested in the story behind the artwork and the artist himself. And that's probably already clear in these videos about Art Start Stories. So now a video about landscapes. In paintings, especially landscapes and narratives, we know the concept of perspective, and it's crucial for both. A painting is flat, but over time people have learned to suggest space and depth. This can be achieved by using perspective in various ways. It influences how the viewer perceives the composition and its components. In a narrative, perspective refers to the point of view from where the story is told. Perspective influences how the reader experiences the story. One could argue that perspective has the same effect on both visual art and narrative. And it is true, kind of. How can visual art help us to write a story? One reason is that perspective helps present objects and scenes realistically, giving them greater depth and dimension. A well-applied perspective makes the drawing or narrative more interesting and engaging for the viewer or the reader. So let's compare three typical perspectives. And we start with the line perspective versus the first person perspective. So the line perspective is a method of creating depth by following the way objects appear from a particle vanishing point. Parallel lines, such as the sides of a building, appear to converge at the vanishing point in the horizon. The vanishing point is therefore the central point toward which everything points and departs. So here we have a painting from Constant Gabriel. It's one of the first paintings, I believe, on which you can see the steam train, so it's quite an old painting, and you see very nice how the vanishing point is in the middle of the painting on the horizon. But that's not always the fact, because on this painting from Peter Sanderdam, the company Belpiece has indicated the vanishing point on this painting, and you see it is somewhere, it's not like we see the horizon. Well, the horizon will be at the back, behind it, but it's nice to see how fast the perspective can work and how important it is. There are always two or more vanishing points. That's also possible. In a first-person perspective, the story is colored by the experience of the central character. The story unfolds simultaneously from the first-person perspective of both the narrator and the reader. As a result, the reader sees the intention and experience of other characters described from the first person's perspective. However, here too, there can be two or more central characters. Only then the story isn't told from the perspective of I, he and she, but from the perspective of the first me, the second me, the third me, and so on. It's very interesting, but also very complex. The narrator can't see into the minds of other characters, which is possible with an omniscient narrator. And the omniscient narrator we can compare with the isometric perspective. Isometric perspective is a two-dimensional representation of three-dimensional object. This method creates the illusion of depth and was often used in Asia. It shows the three sides of an object, top, front and side, all appearing in the same length. The parallel lines are preserved, and importantly, there is no vanishing point. I've never noticed this lack of a vanishing point in this kind of paintings. Even though I'm very familiar with this drawing style. In fact, I've read all of Robert van Gulik's books on Judge Time, and he used this technique for his illustration. Thanks to Van Gulik and his research into the life and work of the 10 famous Judge Tai, which was the Tang Dynasty between 630 and 700, this judge is still popular. In a lot of science fiction films you can see him. His drawing style, from not from the judge but from Gulik, was also typical of that time and later in China. However, this way of using perspective was also very common in Japan. It's a very different technique than using a vanishing point. Well, I learned this while watching the Why It's Art video about Hokusai's Great Wave of Kanagawa. A very interesting video that shows how the isometric perspective was common at the time, as can be seen in this cityscape from the Edo period in the 17th century, and how on the one hand Hokusai refers to the linear perspective, see the location of the Mount Fuji, and on the other hand how Hokusai's work influenced Western artists such as Van Gogh, Degas and Monet in his very famous, beautiful work. So, unlike the first person, the narrative perspective, where the narrator is part of the story, the omniscient narrator hovers above the narrative. This is clearly visible when comparing the two different perspectives. With a vanishing point, you look as if you are inside the painting, while with the isometric perspective, you are essentially suspended above what is visible. Because an omniscient narrator can draw or narrate whatever they want, they can get a very comprehensive overview of everything happening in the story, reducing the reader's own input. And an omniscient narrator can also jump forward in time because the narrator knows everything. There's a danger of filling in or interpreting too much for the reader, making them less active participants in the story. And then there's also the color or atmospheric perspective versus the he-she perspective, especially in seascapes where there are fewer natural lights. This is a compensation for by the use of the color. a technique based on the observation that distant objects become less bright, less detailed and bluer due to the presence of the atmosphere. A master in this field was the Englishman William Turner, active in the early 1800s. One of his most famous work is the Fighting Tremere from 1839. And in anticipation of the video about using abstract art to write stories, one of the pioneers in using colors to suggest depth was the Greek-American painter Daphnis Nassos. During his exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum in New York, he was described as an abstract imagist. I'm familiar with his color plane theory because I was asked to talk about his work in a documentary about him. The principle is that we place warmer colors in the foreground and cooler colors in the background. We also reduce contrast and detail and blur colors and shapes to suggest a sense of distance. Larger objects or surfaces appear closer, while smaller objects and surfaces appear further away. With overlapping objects also help to suggest depth. So we saw with the first person perspective that a story can also be told from three different but equally important first person characters. When told from the second person perspective, the different characters are not equal. However, just like with the first person perspective, the third person perspective brings the reader very close to the feelings, the thought and the experience of the main characters. And the story is colored by the experience and emotions of the different characters. Because the different characters are not equal, a clear layering of meaning is created in the story. Just like in visual art, you also get a narrative that focuses on something more important. Depending on your own writing style, you can also achieve this by creating longer sentences. Overlapping is also a useful technique for creating depth. While you are describing someone, you can, so to speak, spontaneously start comparing that person with another and thereby indicate their mutual importance. When we talk about landscapes, we almost immediately think about the horizontal line. Regardless of our perspective, you determine the depth of your composition through the placement of elements. The use of light and shadows can also emphasize shapes and depth. The horizon, however, is a typical feature of many landscapes. This is an imaginary but often visual line, usually at the observer's eye level, marking the end of our visual range. The horizon is where time begins at sunrise and timeless begins at sunset. We create depth through vagueness. So in this photo we see a ship disappearing in the distance. The depth emphasized by the fisherman visible on the right. Yet the image is quite tranquil, which we can change by raising the horizon and bringing action to the foreground, like in the next photo here. Now, not only does the ship seem further away, but the sea has also taken on a much more prominent place. A horizon that's too high and too little foreground action doesn't create depth, making the image seem rather dull at first glance. The question also arises at why such an empty plane is visible. Well, in a story it works the same way. The first photo describes something disappearing, and halfway through we describe the fisherman. In the second photo we can describe the contrast between the disappearing ship and what the sea throws at us. And in the third photo we see that the horizon is very high and the ship almost disappears from view, but in the foreground almost nothing happened. A vast, deserted expanse of water, the loneliness of vanishing. Such a vast, almost empty expanse of water is sometimes called an open space in a story. Stories and films can become suspenseful because questions are raised that aren't immediately answered. The distance between the open space, the questions, and its interpretation, the answer, is what is called the arc of tensions in stories. Seascapes often use open space. They are often present and somehow still very captivating. This is a very typical painting from Charles-François Daubigny. And we see the other extreme in the work of Ella Loise. You can barely see what is the sea and what is the air. One big, I would say mess, but it's not mess, it's more playground. Everything is alive. Well, among seascapes, naval battles are especially popular, as they involve not only the battle with the opposite side, but also the battle against the sea itself, or even greater natural forces. In the case of the Mongols in Imare Bay at the coast in Kursa in 1281, when they attempt to invade Japan for the second time, and they were destroyed by a massive typhoon, which is the Japanese later named them the kamikaze in a tribute. And now everybody knows what a kamikaze is. Another famous naval battle is that of Trafalgar, where Admiral Nelson and his English fleet defeated the combined French and Spanish navies in an original way. Although he was mortally wounded during the battle, but both the admiral and the naval battle have been immortalized in many, many ways, like in this painting. Time and rhythm. Time can be depicted in various ways. A rising sun indicates morning, and a setting sun indicates in the evening. In other works, that sun might hang high with little shadow, indicating the midday. As the day progresses, the sun hangs lower and the shadows become longer. Fresh green plants are especially common in the spring, and a vast palette of falling leaves indicates autumn. The same with snow. Well, it's in the winter. The same place looks very different at different times of the year. Paul Cézanne works, for example, are famous for capturing different moments from a single vantage point, such as a mountain. We see how the mountain itself constantly changes in appearance, but also how its presence relates to the surroundings. Those who saw the video about portraits will remember that I was talking about the influence of the background. And in this series we see essentially the same thing. The mountain is a subject, and the color temperature of the sky is a background. It determines the atmosphere. Light consists of different colors. Light doesn't always have the same composition. If there is a lot of red, the color is warmer, in the evening, for example. If there is a lot of blue, it's colder. For painters, the northern lights are the brightest and most beautiful, which is in many ways that the studios have north-facing windows. And the color temperature indicates the composition of the light. Stories are essentially the same. Using praise through a story creates a very pleasant atmosphere, but it also colors the story significantly. Well, Cézanne painted numerous paintings, particularly of the mountain of Sainte-Victoire-Pare, each with its own stories. Such a series beautifully captures the rhythm of time. Piet Mondrian, on the other hand, was interested in different rhythms. This is a typical example of a childhood work, where we see the dancing trees along the Rhine River. Well, that's not the official name, but Mondrian was a passionate dancer. And the daughter of one of the women he regularly danced with told me, when I was giving a guiding, that he was also a very good dancer. And the row of trees along may be not very telling a lot, but the reflection in the water suggests to me that he must have seen dancing trees there. He was fascinated by trees, perhaps because in his youth, through the high living room windows, He primarily saw trees, not the street. I noticed this when I give tours of his birthplace in Amersfoort. When you're small, the windows were very high and then very nice to see. For many, the evolution of how he painted a tree is a prime example of his path to abstraction. I used to think so too, but in the next video I'll show you that's not the case at all. Well, in fact, incidentally, I already made a video about Mondrian's path to abstraction. So the link you find below. And how does the story continue now? Well, dialogue is very important for conveying the impressions, opinions and ideas of characters, which applies to all types of stories. Through dialogue, you can also build suspense by playing on trustworthiness of a character. Suspense can also build because the reader has more knowledge than some characters. Dialogue also occurs in visual art, because also there the chosen objects rarely appear in the work by chance. They often interact strongly, and this can be visual but also very substantive. For example, in Vietnam, VN depicted the absurdity of climbing Mountain Everest here. The vanishing point here is at the top of the mountain. That's where all the tourists are vanishing. The contrast between light and dark areas accentuates the mountain scale. This contrast exists not only on the mountain itself but also in the sky. And it's also interesting that the photographer used both spotlight and zoom to create depth. In the front you see almost the faces of the people, well, but they are turned around. But you see them very clearly. And in the past it's the zoom. The absurdity captured here offers many starting points for writing a story. It could be about someone who dreamed for years of conquering that rugged mountain. Over the years that dream becomes more intense and buying many things and becomes increasingly realistic. They are training and everything until that person eventually disappears into a long line of shambling mountain climbers, which is not at all what he was dreaming all those years ago. Choose your perspective carefully and accept the consequence. Experiment with different narrative perspectives and choose the writing style that suits you best for your story. That way, you tell your story most easily. In the next video, we'll explore what stories abstract works can lead to. When will the video be finished? I never know in advance. I usually start with the topic, and for this video it was perspective and the horizon. It's a logical addition. However, those are just two words because I don't know what I'm going to say when I start the video. And when I'm writing, I think, oh, this is interesting, this is not interesting, oh, this is too far away from the story, and so on. So for the next video about abstract art, the thing that strikes me most is how much the artists explain about their work. So thanks for watching, and comments and questions are always appreciated, as is subscribing to our channel. We love that. See you again.